Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those, depending on the time zone that you are in. I'm delighted to welcome you to the theme of today's webinar, the sanctions compliance in the Nordics. And I'll go through very briefly in terms of the key issues and topics that we'll discuss today, but we can move to the next slide. Introduce myself. I'm Chase Danius, Global Head of Financial Crime and Industry Affairs at Refinitiv. We work very closely, of course, with many different industry sectors as far as understanding the sanctions environment that we're currently in with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I'll make sure that we draw upon specifically in terms of the impact of the Nordic region in particular. Which hasn't been given enough due and attention in terms of potential impact in the region, and whether in fact sanctions is effective overall. And we'll hear from our speakers in a few moments. Move to the next slide. A few housekeeping items. Please do submit your questions. I will attempt to get to them in the order in which they were sent. There is a survey at the end of this session to make sure that we highlight and make sure that we tailor these issues and these webinars in the future in the absolute best way. If you're having any technical issues, do refresh your browser, but hopefully the system will work well. And if you do have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to submit them as you see them. So if we can move to the next slide, if I can introduce our speakers. We will hear from an incredible panel here with Ruta, who's from the Lithuanian Sanctions Task Force and AML Center of Excellence. We'll also hear from Ilse, who's the head of Financial Intelligence Unit in Latvia. And they are very much on the front lines of dealing with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and especially the sanctions, which affects not only the Baltic regions, but affects all of the Nordic organizations, whether the banks or corporates, in terms of how to deal with this issue. And if I could just spend a few moments to give you context in terms of our company, if we move to the next slide. We are a technology company. We've been helping organizations deal with data and sanctions for many, many years. And in fact, if you look at how we started way back in the 1850s, the data at that point was stock prices between Aachen, Germany, and Brussels, and the technology that we used at that point was in fact carrier pigeons at that point. And throughout the years and throughout the decades, we've evolved and very much sort of part of a key technology aspect in terms of how we support the market and fighting financial crime and also meeting their sanctions obligations. If we could pass through a few slides, Imran, if that's okay. Now I'd like to move to the opening remarks from our speakers. And maybe, and as we do that, just a quick sense that the sanctions environment that we currently live in is really unprecedented as far as we're concerned. In all my years, certainly in financial services, I haven't seen anything quite like the scale and the speed and the types of sanctions that are being imposed. This chart here is an indication of for this year alone, where we see the sanctions authorities really pushing new sanctions being placed on Russia and Belarus and other countries as well. And the key theme here is, unlike in the past, we've seen Europe being a real avant-garde in terms of pushing new sanctions against the Russia Federation in particular. In fact, 95% of the sanctions that we see are what we call narrative sanctions or implicit sanctions. So these are not just against individuals, but in fact, they're against entire sectors, which is by its nature can be difficult for many organizations to sift through and to identify the types of exposure that they may have to customers or companies that they do business with. And the slide here not just shows about the European Union, but of course, United Kingdom, Switzerland, are in fact the leaders on a number of sanctions being imposed, and the U.S. in fact is not the one that is imposing the most of them. So We'll talk about whether the nature of these sanctions, how they affect the region, how they affect the Baltics in particular, and we'll get into that with our speakers. If we can move to the next slide. We should also remind ourselves, of course, that sanctions is not just a blip in time, but actually can last for decades. And the slide that you see here is an indication of, the number of years that once sanctions are imposed and how long they can last. And in some instances, they can last up to almost close to 70 years. So I suspect that the Russia-Ukraine conflict is not just something that's going to stay with us in terms of the sanctions being imposed, but they can last for many, many, many years. And so organizations should be prepared for that eventuality. If we move to the next slide, very quickly on sanctions, of course, it's not just about identifying companies that you may be exposed to, but also identifying financial instruments that you may be trading in, that you may be using to finance your activity, which of course becomes quite complicated, and hopefully we'll get into that in our discussion. Very quickly, the next slide, if we can, and we'll summarize the pieces here. What are the challenges in the industry? The first is sometimes can be difficult to identify the authorities and also the organizations that you do business with. And it's also difficult sometimes to ascertain the types of sanctions and how they apply to your organization. And of course, these things are changing daily, weekly. In just the last week alone, our team has been working on 13,000 updates on the types of sanctions that are being imposed all across the world, and that's changing on a weekly basis. So this gives you a sense that this issue is here to stay. It's going to have a significant impact, in our view, in the Nordic region, and whether organizations have presence in the Baltics or maybe where they have indirect exposure to the Baltics. These issues are going to be front and center of many of Nordic banks and corporates who are dealing with this conflict. So, without further ado, if you move to the next slide, really let me open it up now to our speakers. We'll give a 10-minute introduction on their view on this issue, how it's affecting their work in terms of promoting public-private partnerships, how it's affecting their work as a financial intelligence unit, and how they work across the sector in terms of the impact that it has, but also try to navigate through this very complex issue. So without further ado, please, Ruta, let me invite you to give our first opening remark, and then we'll hear from Ilse, and then we'll open up for Q&A. Please, Ruta, the floor is yours. Very welcome.
Thank you very much, Chair. I hope you are hearing me well. So a little bit
Perfect.
Background about myself and the background which I'm coming from. So as Chair already introduced, I'm coming from the Center of Excellence in Anti-Money Laundering. This is a public-private partnership that was established in Lithuania almost a year ago. I think it is important to note that we operate as a complete separate institution. That means that we're not under any other institution, whether it would be FIU or any other institution. Regarding the Sanctions Task Force Group, this was formed also last year, coming from the sanctions package that was imposed on Belarus last June. So the group has been operating quite actively currently since the war in Ukraine has started. The group is composed of the public and private stakeholders. From the private side, we have obviously the financial institutions, and from the public side, we have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the FIU, our regulator, the Bank of Lithuania, and the Customs Department. So basically, we are trying to tackle and to look into the complex sanctions regime that we have been dealing with from different angles. And of course, composing our forces together in order to implement and enforce sanctions effectively. Regarding my opening remarks, I think I don't need to give a rundown on the sanctions that we are currently experiencing, and I'm pretty sure that our participants on the webinar are pretty well aware of different sanctions that we have been dealing, and as well as different regimes. However, I would like to emphasize, I think now, the three main points. The first thing, sanctions as a foreign policy tool used to be or have to be targeted. However, currently, what we have been experiencing, that there is no such thing as targeted sanctions anymore. No matter how accurately, I think, and how closely, for example, the European Union tries to target sanctions, we already have collateral consequences, and we will have collateral consequences. And I think when it comes to financial institutions or whether businesses, what is important to understand that there is no such thing as targeted sanctions. We have to understand that sanctions will affect all of us. That is why stakeholders from public and private sector must work together in order to enforce them effectively, because it has definitely effect on all of us. The second thing is definitely how to handle the complexity of the sanctions. And given the divergence and the complexity of the sanctions regimes, because we have to understand that it's not that, for example, Nordic banks or even within the Baltic states, that we operate only within EU sanctions regime. Our institutions definitely follow other sanctions regimes, such as, for example, US sanctions regimes. And as these are sometimes different, there come some compliance challenges when it comes to the implementation of those sanctions. What we have been experiencing currently, and I think everyone is well aware that, for example, in Lithuania and in general with Nordics, our two biggest banks have announced that they have been exiting transactions with Russia, meaning within a certain wind down period, they will not be executing any transactions with Russia. And this does not happen only within financial institutions, but with the businesses as well, meaning they are exiting business relationships with Russia. It is obviously understandable. However, I think the question is whether it undermines the aim of the sanctions. And I think we will definitely discuss this today. What is also important to mention is that the current implementation of the enforcement sanctions, it definitely costs resources, time, energy, and expertise. Because it's not about only processing transactions from the financial institution side, it's mainly you have to investigate. And this investigation you sometimes come up with every transaction that financial institution is actually executing. Meaning from one side, we have compliance costs. And from the other side, we have also reputational costs. The fear of penalties that might come with the sanctions breaches. Because we have to understand that there is no such thing as 100% compliance. It is impossible to ensure that no transaction will ever be executed that has, for example, ties with the sanctioned individuals or sanctioned entities, or have dealings with the trade restrictions or economic restrictions. We have to also remind ourselves that there is no other G20 country that has ever been to such sanctions, subject to such sanctions as Russia is now. That is why, I mean, we could have not been prepared for that. We could have said that the financial institutions come in the sanctions regimes, that they are prepared. However, unfortunately, we sort of caught ourselves in a tornado of sanctions. And what we have to do now is basically to try to work together, because there is no other way on how to effectively implement sanctions and how to effectively enforce sanctions. The third thing is sanctions evasion. For example, coming back to what I've just recently said, the exiting of transactions, meaning executing in and out transactions with Russia, that does not mean that no business will happen with Russia. Russia will evade sanctions, and Russia is evading sanctions, and they are definitely finding ways how to do it. That is why on this side, we will fall really very short if we do not ensure the collaboration between public and private stakeholders. This is the first thing, and this does not need to happen only nationally or like internally within institution. We also have to talk about cross-border collaboration when it comes to sanctions evasion, because all our transactions, they go cross-border. From the Baltics, Nordics, from the Nordics within the whole EU, and then even out of the EU to Asia, to US, wherever continent we are talking about. But we are living in the global world, and all the transactions are like globally connected. That is why the collaboration is actually the key here. Last point is that now the current aim, I think we will discuss also about whether the sanctions work. But what we are trying to do, and what EU and US and all G7 countries are trying to do, we're trying to make the price of the war for Russia unacceptable. And this happens actually in unprecedented coordinated manner, what has to be emphasized here. However, the heavy lifting comes with the financial institutions and in general the financial sector that actually plays critical role when it comes to enforcement of sanctions. That is why what is important to do and what we are trying to do, and I think what the webinar has the goal today is how to help the financial sector not to be lost and not to lose themselves when it comes to enforcement and implementation of sanctions. So I think sanctions as a foreign policy tool is important. It does not work anymore as it should have worked. But what we have to do if we want to make it useful, we cannot leave the most critical part when it comes to enforcement of sanctions, which is financial sector, alone implementing these. And that is why private and public sector collaboration and communication between private and public stakeholders are really very important. So thank you very much. This is my opening remarks, and back to you, Chair.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for those thoughts. And we'll return to a number of the points that you made. But before we do that, Ilse, the floor is yours. Really look forward to hearing your intervention on this topic.
Yes, thank you. I think I need to start by saying a big thanks to you, Chair, and other organizers of this event for this opportunity to address everybody who is present here. And I think it is very important for all of us to stay connected, to continue to share our experiences and thoughts now even more than ever before. Unfortunately, since the recent invasion of Ukraine, the stakes of the EU anti-financial crime and sanctions system have risen dramatically, and our capacity to cooperate in this area is already a matter of not just the national, but European security. A gap in a single jurisdiction opens all Europe to not just the crime, but money that is increasingly used to support hybrid warfare operations. With these stakes in mind, let me highlight some of conclusions from our experience during last 2 months, while all of us not only followed the heartbreaking news from the war zone, but hopefully also fought fiercely to implement the sanctions imposed against the aggressive Russian regime as effectively and correctly as possible. FIUs that I'm representing here traditionally have had a very or relatively narrow role in the field of sanctions. We keep target lists of national and international sanctions, as well as we are the authority of charge of combating of circumvention of national and international sanctions. However, in the case of FIU Latvia, since we are the lead national authority in the field of AML CFT, we do feel an important responsibility to foster an environment of collaboration. We want to provide a platform that brings together leading experts from academia, business, government, international organizations, and NGOs to promote innovative thinking, challenge conventional wisdom, and reduce the gap between public and private sectors. Therefore, not only we have organized annual sanction conference starting in 2019, but we are on the first day of war, we informed our partners on several initiatives that will be commenced in parallel to the existing ones. Thus, we became the central point for exchange of information between different government agencies and between public and private sector using our very well-established cooperation coordination platform that is led by FIU. We also try to provide assistance to private and public sector actors in interpretation and practical application of sanction regulations. And all of this happens in parallel to cooperation mechanisms that were established 3-4 years ago when Latvia was executing the overhaul of its AML CFT system, aiming to implement FADAC, or its regional body, MONEYVAL, recommended actions. That reform process not only allowed us to become the first European and second country in the world that fully has implemented all 14 FADAC recommendations, but also advanced us to such a level of collaboration and awareness that I'm certain no other country in the EU has. Let me be honest, however, that I'm very concerned that not all European countries are treating the issue of sanctions in the same way as we do. Because one of the reasons there's no single coordinating voice from the European Commission. Lack of harmonization, capacity, and solidarity are the main reasons why the gap between political will to impose the sanctions and practical execution of them is still very, very big. As we know, the European Commission imposes the sanctions, then issues some guidelines on how to apply them, but does not examine individual cases, even if they exceed the borders of one member state. And all practical issues are dealt at the national level. This may lead, and I am sure it leads to situations where different countries have different interpretations and, of course, application of sanction regime. It is not clear how to apply sanctions if they are not related to a direct breach, but to interpretation. We know that sanctioned persons are very rarely seen directly hitting the sanction list. We know that it requires a high level of experience to understand very many layers used in order to hide the true ownership of the that can belong to sanctioned person. In parallel, all financial institutions conduct an independent investigation of partners and their transactions, which requires more resources, and it is not reversible in links. Even if 10 banks find that the company is under control of an authorized person, there is no authority to turn to and request to be included in the sanctions list. All this leads, on the one hand, to ineffective risk management of sanctions, and on the other hand, to over-compliance by the financial sector. And as I already told you, my belief is that the expertise differs from country to country. I'm a true advocate since I was the one who led the Latvia's endeavors to implement all the Moneyval recommended actions and not to be grey-listed by FATF. That Latvia is undoubtedly can be a role model for the most of jurisdictions. For example, we are already very, we have very high expertise since, because of our geographical location, and we believe that the expertise might be weaker in the old Europe countries, and unfortunately, I have to say also in Nordic countries. As to our expertise, Latvia already in 2019 finalized its sanction risk assessment, including proliferation financing risk assessment, which was the second such type risk assessment in the world. We have been monitoring and assessing sanction risks for a long time. Secondly, the threats that stem from the Latvia's geographical location, when we have an external border with Russia and Belarus, allows us to understand the sanctioning regime very in depth. We knew our duties, we knew how big is the risk, and therefore the implementation of the sanctions regime right now is more easy for us compared to other countries. We are focusing on decreasing our national vulnerabilities in sanction regimes, and we believe we are quite successful. Of course, it is also important to mention that if a country wants to implement sanction regime effectively, there is a need for an effective and compliant legal framework. In our case, such framework is already in place since 2019. It is also very important that in Latvia we prohibited to service certain shell companies with, for example, no real economic activity, as well as those who are registered in jurisdictions where no financial statements shall be submitted. It is also very important and helps us a lot that in Latvia we have one of the strongest UBO registers in the world. No limited liability companies registered in Latvia can be registered there without known UBO. And of course, sanction law. We have the sanction law that allows us to apply the sanctions of United Nations, of EU, as well as NATO member states. There is clear obligations for all entities, and the sanction law is applicable to all persons. And that brings us to the next point, where we believe that the vulnerability of Latvia is lower compared to other countries. We have very, very strong coordination mechanisms. First, of course, PPPs, or Cooperation Coordination Platform led by FIU, where the supervisors, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, law enforcement agencies, but always private sector is part of. Then, of course, we have a Sanction Coordination Council that is already the system where never new sanction comes into force. There's immediate coordination activity amongst all stakeholders. And now we established AML Innovation Hub. It is established within the auspices of FIU, and that will be the first international initiative that will create a sandbox for cross-institutional and transnational use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other data analytics instruments in order to fight also sanctions evasion. Of course, we also made sure that we have effective outreach to the law enforcement agencies as well as the private sector. There are guidance on SDR reporting on sanction regime, as well as the specific guidance by regulators and law enforcement agencies. And as I mentioned already, annual sanction conference. Looking back from all what I said here, I think that the Latvia's experience shows that for Europe's sanction to be meaningful, competent authority leading these regimes must be willing and able to cooperate. Second, without solidarity, the system will fail. Countries with the successful AML and sanction regimes are considered less competitive markets than neighbors with more lax enforcement standards. And of course, third, speed is of essence. I think I will conclude with very, very famous quote from my dear book from my childhood, Alice Adventures in Wonderland, where in one of the episodes, Alice gets an important life lesson that comes often to my mind. It takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. Sometimes the sanctioning regime might seem the same difficult, that's true, but we have to continue to adapt and evolve in order to survive this ever-changing world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilse. There's so much there to unpack, and I look forward to doing that with Ruta as well. And maybe, Ruta, if I can turn over to you, if there's anything that you'd like to contemplate in terms of some of the responses. There's a lot there that we can get into in more detail. How is the system working? How are the banks coping in the Nordics, and in particular in the Baltic region? There's the point about sanctions aren't really applied equally, and there's a lack of effectiveness and equal treatment, if you will, on some of this. And then we can get into some of the more specific items in terms of how this informs potentially reform in the EU in general, as the AML legislative package is currently going through reform, in which sanctions policy has been, I'm sure, been a wake-up call to many in terms of what needs to be done, including shell company reform and public registry reform. So there's a lot there to unpack, Ruta, but let me hand it over to you, and anything in particular that you'd like to comment on.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I think, first of all, a little bit reflecting on the beneficial ownership and registers and the whole situation. And I think this shows how connected, actually, enforcement of sanctions is in general with the enforcement of the ML rules or terrorist financing prevention rules. And once again, we are coming back to basics. And the homework that we did not do before now comes as a challenge in general within the EU, because we have really different implementation of beneficial ownership registries, whether they are sometimes open or not open. And I'm really glad to hear the Latvian example. However, unfortunately, it's not the reality of many other EU countries. So I think it is important to know that, you know, all the oligarchs and sanctioned individuals or entities, over the past years, they have been using those complex shell company structures. They have incorporated their interests for the complex financial instruments, investments that did not happen during the night. They are already prepared. They concealed the beneficial ownership. That is why we are sort of having, you know, a double-sided compliance challenge. It's not about enforcing regulation. It's also about identifying who are we targeting, because it's not about targeting, you know, it's not about enforcing regulation on the directly sanctioned individual or legal entity. It's also about those who are indirectly benefiting. And I think this is it's like the challenge that financial institutions are facing, because it's, you know, it's very easy to screen the list, but then what? We have the complex ownership structure that have to be revealed somehow. So I think this is also an important point to make, that unfortunately, the homework that we did not do before now comes to us from the other side. And I think it's a huge reminder that we have to move forward with the enforcing with the ML regulations. So I think this is the first point. Another point, which is also very important, is the uniform application. I really do agree with what Ilse said, is that, once again, unfortunately, the application of the sanctions regulation currently is really different without EU countries. There comes a guidance from the European Commission. And I think what already we have witnessed is that the Commission interprets the provisions of the sanctions regulation way broader than it is actually written, meaning we do not implement regulation by word. We are going beyond that. And this is, I think, another sort of indication that we might be transforming the sanctions regime within the EU. There is a room for interpretation left for the national competent authorities. And I think we have to admit that not all national competent authorities were ready to deal with such huge of provisions and to understand what they actually means and how they should be implemented. We did have sanctions regulations before, for example, 2014 regarding the Russian annexation of Crimea, the Belarus sanctions, but still they were never so complex and targeting so widely. As we said, it's not about only financial restrictions. We have trade restrictions, we have economic sanctions, which are way more difficult to implement when it comes to, for example, asset freeze. That's way easier than we come to the dual-use goods, proliferation financing, and there comes a lot of different complex subjects. That is why I'm more like prone when it comes, the guidance comes within the EU, and we all implement the regulation in the same way, because this is the only way how we can actually implement and to enforce regulation effectively. This is also a helping hand for the financial institutions. We also have to remind ourselves that financial institutions, they do not operate within one country. When it comes to Nordics, we also have banks which, for example, have branches in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, then they're operating in Sweden. So the markets are interconnected. That is why if the guidance comes within the EU and the national competent authority comes in and helps the financial sector and the businesses to implement it, I think that is the way forward, definitely. So yeah, so I think that's for myself currently.
Thank you so much. Ilse, let me bullet, well, two questions really. The first is, how are the banks in the Nordics coping as far as you see it? Clearly, there's quite a significant presence of the Scandinavian banks, Danske Bank and many of the Swedish banks. What are you seeing are some of the trends in terms of affecting their behavior, potentially affecting their risk, or anything else that you're observing from your perspective? And then the second piece, which is something we should discuss further, and the point being made, as far as I'm concerned, that sanctions actually may not be working. The system may not actually be set up to have an effective sanctions program, to the point that was made previously on different applications, different interpretations, and many other aspects that we'll get into in a moment. But let me ask on that: A, what do you see as some of the trends of behavior of some of the Scandinavian and Nordic banks, and B, what's your view on why you think the sanctions program isn't working? What needs to be done?
Yeah, thank you for those two questions. I think from the experience of Latvian banks, also those who are owned by the Scandinavian shareholders, or who have their headquarters in Nordics, I think the compliance level and ability to really implement the sanctions are very high. As I already tried to explain that in my opening speech, that this very hard lesson that we had to learn or go through in 2018-19 allowed us right now to really advance to a level that that our banks clearly understand how to read laws, how to read regulations, how to implement them. And besides, we also had some experience with already OFAC sanctioned persons here in Latvia in 2019, and some couple of persons who were sanctioned by OFAC were serviced by those Nordic banks, which most probably you have on your mind while asking the question. Therefore, those banks, together with the government agencies, including us, were so knowledgeable in dealing with. And to my understanding, Nordic banks are not the ones who should be worried about their ability to apply sanctions properly. Sometimes we can speak about some other banks who were mainly involved in non-resident business previously, who still suffer from that level of expertise that Nordic banks do have here in Latvia. And I would be very happy if those who are listening right now from the headquarters would ask their colleagues in Latvian banks to share this awareness and this expertise with all the group entities. As I said, private sector in Latvia is very knowledgeable. When it comes to your second question, the answer will not be so optimistic and positive. Unfortunately, I need to admit that although I am a true believer of democratic regimes and sanctions as the non-violent response to the violent aggression, I think this is so far from reality, that political will to impose sanctions and hope that they will have an immediate outcome, or at least have such an outcome or result that we believe to have it. There are so many issues right now, but the most important one is, if Europe wants us to have a unified approach, harmonized approach, there should be some activity from European Commission made towards every single country to understand its duties. It is about the national ability to really understand what is required from them, then of capacity. There are so few countries in the EU that has not only or has illustrated its activity by political will, by providing resource to those authorities, to those agencies that will implement sanction regime, like law enforcement, security agencies, supervisors, FIUs, we know that the resource is always at stake. And all of the AML, CFT, and sanction regime authorities are so under-resourced. If I just traveled from one member state, I will not mention the name, it was so sad for me to see, again, the agency that is responsible for implementing sanctions, and we know that there are just 4 such countries in the EU that has clearly stipulated that this will not be Ministry of Foreign Affairs that will be responsible for a sanction regime. But for example, FIU, that's Lithuania, Estonia, Czech Republic, and then Hungary. And those FIUs, I believe, they are not having that resource that is required in order to implement sanction regime properly. Moreover, is there a true understanding that we are not dealing anymore with some couple of sanctioned persons? We are dealing with more than 1,000. It is just incredible amount that requires resource, financial, technical, capacity building for those who are applying this, and none of this happening. Moreover, journalists, general public requires us to be as effective as possible, and we ourselves want to be such. It is so painful to see those news from Ukraine. But when it comes to the realizing that one thing is to announce something politically, and another one is to provide resource, so there is this gap. I hope I answered your question.
Absolutely, and more. So thank you very much for that sobering remark. And I want to make sure that Ruta has a chance to reflect on that as well. But again, there's a few things that are clearly the message here. Capacity building is not equal to the task and requirements and expectations of the public sector. And also the other piece, which I want to hear Ruta also talk about, is the unintended benefits, if you will, of public-private partnerships. Initially, they were set out to really tackle, and we as a company are big promoters of public-private partnerships in terms of tackling more effective means for information sharing. But in fact, from a sanctions policy perspective, it also shows that there's more that needs to be done at a European level beyond the national member state level. That, of course, Lithuania and Latvia are big promoters of doing those things. So maybe Ruta, your reflections in terms of lack of capacity building, what you see are the benefits from your example, and what you're leading in the Center of Excellence there, and also potentially some lessons learned at the European Commission level as they discuss the AML legislative package, which of course is incredibly broad, but I think there's some lessons learned here from a capacity building and other things that may lead to a more effective regime in the future.
Yes, thank you very much of those questions. Yeah, I think I will reflect firstly about all the undercapacity and the capacity building, the expertise building. I think one of the biggest benefits that happened, for example, in Lithuania, I think this is an example, what can happen within unfortunate situation that we're having the war in Ukraine. However, Lithuania has introduced the new sanctions law just last week. We managed to pass the law within 2 weeks. And it comes with a transformation, with the additional budget for the FIU and etc. I don't want to get in the details, but I just want to stress that the unfortunate situation that is happening in the war in Ukraine, which is happening, it actually is bringing the real benefits of the sanctions regime, the implementation of those sanctions regime within countries. Now, Lithuania is an example. Coming to the public-private partnerships, as I'm like a huge promoter of the public-private partnerships, I think what it brings, the first thing is communication. It sounds very simple. I do understand that, but unfortunately, what we have been trying to do during last year, we were trying to learn to communicate back to the basics, sitting around the table with all stakeholders that, for example, are involved in sanctions currently. We have a really very active role of the FIU and the Customs Department. the Bank of Lithuania. I think what we do understand now, and what this period of 2 months have shown, that the collaboration which is happening between public and private stakeholders, it gives certain level, I think, of confidence when it comes to implementing certain provisions. And this is very important because not everything can be written on the paper, as we say, and published, for example, as an official opinion from the regulator, but we can have our internal rules on how to tackle one or other issue. However, the problem which comes with the public-private partnerships, I think that we still lack the guidance within the EU, and I'm very optimistic that the new ML package could actually bring this. It's not that we need regulation or directive, but we need guidance that could help, for example, to foster transnational public-private partnerships. I think what current sanction regime shows, for example, just coming back a little bit to what Ilza said about Latvia, and they have the implementation of the NATO country sanctions, for example, as US OFAC sanctions. Lithuania does not have that. And we have only the UN and EU sanctions, which is obligatory here. So sometimes we lack knowledge and expertise that might come with the implementation of the OFAC sanctions, and is also needed. That is why PPP, I think, the public-private partnership on the national scale, if it goes beyond our borders, and if we collaborate between different PPPs, I think the result and the benefits which would reach way more bigger scope of stakeholders. This is the first thing. However, we need guidance, because when we talk about public-private partnership, and I think the critical point here is information sharing. This is the essence and the heart of the public-private partnership, and the tactical information sharing, especially also within sanctions particular cases, particular reporting of the sanctions breaches, the information that might be useful also for other entities. Because, one financial entity might have one client and another entity might have the same client, but if they are not able to share the information, then collaboration is not happening, and we actually are not able in general to talk about enforcement of sanctions. That is why I think moving to the transnational element, allowing and giving guidance on how to preserve, I think, the information security and all the GDPR issues, but still enforcing and allowing the information sharing happen not only internally within our borders, but moving beyond to Nordics within European Union, or even moving across the EU. So I think that's the most important thing. And yeah, this is our experience so far, and I think it's really working. And I want to encourage also everyone who is speaking, and especially financial institutions, do not be afraid to sit next to the same table with the FIU and the regulator, because they will not come back to you with a penalty. They are here to help you, because sometimes, I think it's also important to stress here that there is sometimes fear that if financial institutions share something, it will bounce back. So I want to encourage actually to share and to try to communicate internally, especially the challenges that the national competent authority, whether it is FIU or Ministry of Affairs or your regulator, they will come with a helping hand because they have their certain expertise. So yeah, I think it's really important to raise this issue and to raise the importance of public-private partnerships.
No, and thank you for that, Ruta. I think that's a great segue into exploring that topic. And for pure transparency's sake, for the audience, we as a company are big promoters of public-private partnerships. Not only have we engaged and started or founded the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, which is a cross-sector consortium of organizations across law enforcement, the banking community, and beyond. But we're also engaged quite directly with the European Commission, which is reflected, in fact, on the AML legislative package on public-private partnerships and a number of other reforms as well. So we are no strangers, nor are we, hide behind the fact that we're big promoters on that. And maybe, Ilza, to your point, because your FIU and the leadership that you've provided in the last few years, clearly, partly driven by some of the scandals in the past, but to that point, in terms of the benefits of public-private partnerships, as you see it, if you can give us some examples of that, I think that would be great. The second piece to the question I asked Ruta, as well as, PPPs, and not just public and private sector partnerships, by the way, we're also promoters of private-to-private partnerships as well, akin to 314B of the Patriot Act in the US, And maybe you can share some thoughts about that in terms of if you had your wish list to the European Commission on making this Russia-Ukraine horrible conflict a moment in history in terms of lessons learned and what we need to do more of, then I would love to hear your thoughts on those particular points.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, I think I'm one of the biggest fans of the public-private partnerships, not only here domestically, but also regionally. I was the one who promoted this idea that Latvia should introduce something like this in the system in 2017, when I was myself in the private sector, but I was drafting my team was drafting the national risk assessment for Latvia, and at that time we also were requested to provide a high-level action plan how to improve the system here in Latvia, AML CFT system. So one of my answers was that we should introduce this mechanism of information sharing between public and private sector. And in 2018, when I joined the FIU, became its head of this Latvian FIU, 2 months later, we started to implement the clause in our AML law that allows us to cooperate between public and private agencies. I think there is no other way in our modern AML, very demanding AML world, how to be at least to some extent effective in implementing all the regulations and all the needs that are there if a country does not have a public-private partnership. Of course, it's not a big secret that very many countries announce that they do have a public-private partnership, but that they have something which is just some kind of mechanism for sharing strategic initiatives, some kind of mechanism for sharing strategic analysis. We do it differently. From day one, we started to share operational analysis. We started to become as fierce as possible to detecting and also combating criminal activities and trying to really to coordinate and to join forces of private and public sector. So our PPP, and I would put that as an example, which was also that RUSI, very famous think tank, also listed us in its research on PPPs as very effective. So we have operational analysis, we have also strategic analysis pillar, and then we also, of course, use our public-private partnership for different initiatives like sanctioning regime nowadays. I will not mention all of those brilliant initiatives that we had in relation to tackling money laundering or some other AML system initiatives, but or predicate offense. But today, what we noticed, what is the most important, and why I think it was first hour when I woke up, read the news on Ukraine, and called together all the stakeholders, saying that right now, most probably we will experience something that has never been experienced by the systems all over the Europe, by AML systems. If banks and financial sector, sometimes, of course, to some level of expertise, DNFBPs, understood their duties in relation to implementation sanctioning regime, that was not always the case with registries. And we know that today, one of the most problematic issues is to really not only to detect to whom belong what, but also to have those blocking measures on those assets that are movable or immovable. And right now, our PPP helps to really exchange the information between private sector when, for example, some bank or several banks have detected some relationship, some control over the one or another company, and we use that information that has been provided by private sector to us to inform also registries, and vice versa. So if registries from their analysis understand that they should have more or they have more information that some private sector does, a representative does, then they use us as the such kind of exchange, central point of exchange of information, and that allows us to really quickly tackle or quickly block all those assets that belong to the sanctioned persons, whether directly or indirectly. So if that mechanism would not be in place, most probably we will be caught in the same situation as very many other countries. In relation to your second question, I think, of course, when we met, I think it was 2 months ago, we both were invited to speak or to present our highlights on what is lacking in new AML package. And maybe you remember I said that it is not understandable, not for me nor for anybody else, why the AML authority will be established or will start its operations just in 2026. It is too late. Now we realize not only it's too late, but the mandate of that authority should be expanded. We should have some authority, one single point of contact, one point which provides explanation, guidance, just support and collaboration, also in relation to sanctions. So my ask to Europe, to European Commission, please extend the mandate of new authority. Thank you.
That's fantastic, and thank you so much for those thoughts. And as the hour, top of the hour comes to us quickly, just a few reflections. Well, first, a reference that Ilse made, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which is a well-established and well-known think tank based in the UK. It's doing incredible work in terms of promoting and doing some research in the public-private partnership space. And encourage you to look at their work. On the other piece that's been mentioned several times, in terms of the public registry reform, which is another piece that we're very strongly promoters of. A, we're glad that it's reflected in the AML legislative package. B, we're also happy that there's a recognition that they need to be interoperable as well, which leads to a number of different conversations around standardization of naming conventions and all the rest of it. But equally, we can't just think of the European borders, but we need to extend the interoperability from a global perspective, since the nature of the activity that's being hidden in plain sight through complex ownership structures. And then the last piece, I can't think of a better way to underline that point as well, regarding the need for more coordination in Europe. And if there's one thing that this Russia-Ukraine conflict has taught us, really, beyond the humanitarian aspect of all of this, is the need for greater consistency application at the European Union level. And to your point, is that may need that, in fact, the AML authority, which is currently being discussed in terms of where it's going to be established, and its mandate should be expanded to include, national security issues like sanctions policies from a coordination and an implementation perspective. So I will leave it there. Please join me in thanking Ruta and Ilse for their unvarnished thoughts, very sobering thoughts on this. I suspect that this will not be the last time we'll talk about sanctions policy in particular on this issue. The other piece, I guess, is it's very complex. It's not just meeting EU sanctions policies, it's meeting the 64 other sanctions authorities, including, of course, OFAC in the US, but many others across the world. It's a complex issue that you shouldn't probably do on your own, but look at the best way organization can support you. So let me leave it at that. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. We'll make sure that we provide the presentation, and also we'll circulate the recording of the webinar in due course. So with that, thank you very much. Have a great afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.